He works with Indigenow, whose mission is to work with indigenous artists and performers, traditional and contemporary, to bring their voices and messages to the world. Dr. Bronitsky has worked on every continent except Antarctica, which is a very global presence here. We're happy to have you. And finally, Dr. Bronitsky's asked if we can just leave our questions in the chat and he'll answer them. Thank you. Dr. Bronitsky, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I really want to thank the New Mexico Interfaith Dialogue for inviting me to speak on this topic. A little explanation might be in order first. First, perhaps a little of what it is not. This is not going to be about sweat lodges, sun dances, shamans, animal spirit guides. And it's not the result of years of detailed research and focus groups and surveys. What it is, it's really a personal statement about experiences that I've had and people who have been my teachers and what I've thought about. So with that, perhaps really a little more background about me would be good, which is essentially, what is my history and how did I get to this place? Well, as he mentioned, I grew up in Albuquerque. And in 1987, I had a key moment. In 1987, I was living here then, and I was working with the All Indian Pueblo Council and the late and much missed Herman Ogoyo in a voter registration drive in honor of Miguel Trujillo, who was the Isleta Pueblo man who sued New Mexico in 1948 to get the vote for Indians, since the state constitution denied Indians the right to vote. Anyway, we had a meeting with various Pueblo governors about voting and the drive. And afterwards, we were sitting around relaxing. And for reasons that I can't remember anymore, several of the governors started to complain about missionaries, how they didn't respect you, they were coming at you all the time. And really, it suddenly occurred to me that I had heard these complaints before from Jews. And that really got me to thinking. Over the years, I've been talking and I've been listening in all sorts of settings. After Shabbat services in Denver with Rex Lee Jim, who later became a Navajo vice president, with Cherokee stomp dancers in the Stokes Smith stomp dance grounds near Sallisaw, Oklahoma, during a midnight break in the dances and more. And perhaps the most memorable took place in the airport in Frankfurt, Germany, with members of the Chinle Valley Singers. The Chinle Valley Singers are a traditional Navajo music and dance group I work with. They've been overseas 12 times, and we had just finished touring Latvia, and we're sitting in the airport in Frankfurt waiting for our flight home. Now, when I tour overseas, when I can, I try to do Jewish things, go to services or whatever. And in Latvia, doing Jewish things mainly means sites of slaughtered Jews and memorials to the dead. And I had worn my kippah during these visits. And while we're sitting there in Frankfurt, one of us, and I can't remember who anymore, said, we should create a Navajo word for Jew. Boy, and much discussion ensued. And I have to give full credit to Dempsey Deswood, who came up with the solution. He came up with the phrase, Bich Ayaji Dene, which is Navajo which means people who wear little hats. And then we started talking about Jews and Navajos during the long wait for our plane back to the United States, and started talking about what's it like to be a minority, but still have our own history, our own ways, while living in the world all around us. And this experience has been mutual in some really unexpected ways. Several of the Chinle Valley Singers have been to my home for Shabbat dinner, and I've been to their homes for a coming of age, for a first laugh, for other things. And I make my own challah, and they loved it. So Linda Davis, who's now the leader of the group, invited me to attend a Kina Alda for her granddaughter. That's a coming of age ceremony for Navajo women, lasts about 4 days. So being polite, I said, what would you like me to bring to the Kina Alda? And they all said, challah. So I brought a challah, they got the challah, and I got a piece of the ritual sun cake. It was really a fair trade. So it helps to think that since the first contact of Europeans with the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, each colonial government has adopted policies which view the status of Indian as solely dependent on the colonial government's goodwill, whether political, legal, or moral. Within their perceived mandates, these colonial governments developed and reinforced an ideology which enforced this distinction between high culture, European, of course, and low culture, Indian. And whole generations of American Indians were pressured to accept assimilation as the only solution to the problems of cultural and economic domination. Carlisle Boarding School in Pennsylvania was really the center of Indian boarding school education for a long time, and it influenced education at other schools throughout the United States. And the founder of Carlisle Boarding Schools said that the philosophy of the school was kill and save the child. Odd customs and language and long hair, and turn them into essentially docile, obedient, brown white people. But similarly, Christian and Muslim governments have often regarded their own religions and their own beliefs as superior. Beliefs of Jews and other religious minorities were all too often seen as inferior, with the political status of members of these minorities dependent on the goodwill of the majority. And in many eras of Jewish history, governments have encouraged Jews to regard assimilation or conversion as the solution to minority status. One Jewish assimilationist movement, in fact, had as one of its slogans, "Be a Jew at home and a man on the street." So Jews and Indians have fought for the right to worship openly and freely and to survive as different peoples and distinct peoples. And by listening to each other, we can reach out to each other. And perhaps the best way to start that is to think about what we share. I think that Jews and American Indians in general begin by sharing a historic date and a percentage. The historic date is 1492. Yes, that was the year that Columbus discovered people who actually weren't lost and knew where they were. And it led to disaster. Within 50 years after Columbus entered what is now the Caribbean, the Indians of the Caribbean were gone. They were dead, they'd been slaved out. And for Jews, 1492 was the year of the expulsion from Spain, ending 800 years of Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula, with a great deal of cruelty and death and dispersion. The percentage we share is the percentage 90%. What do I mean by that? A number of studies, historical studies, have suggested that American Indian populations dropped by as much as 90% after the first European contact. In the basin of Mexico, which is larger than Mexico City, but includes it, a number of estimates have suggested there were as many as 2.5 to 3 million Indians when the Europeans arrived. Within 70 years, there were maybe 1 million, probably much less than that. And you see it again and again. On the Great Plains in the Dakotas, when Lewis and Clark come through, they see Mandan villages, which are, a lot of people and doing very well. A lot of horses, hunting buffalo, really a well-to-do community. 30 years after Lewis and Clark visit the Mandan country in the Dakotas, other Europeans coming through notice that there are villages where there's no one left to bury the dead. They're all dead, and it's all disease. In New Mexico, we see it. Again, probably 90% of the population died in the 1600s from disease and from starvation as the Spaniards began imposing tribute, and from slavery. Most New Mexicans don't realize it, but slavery, Indian slavery, played a major role in New Mexico. And I recommend very strongly a book called The Other Slavery, which is about American Indian slavery particularly in the United States and the Caribbean, and has an excellent chapter about slavery in New Mexico. There were slave markets here at Taos, at Pecos, near Gran Quivira. And Mexicans were slavers, but so were the Comanches. It was quite something. So as a result, in the 1600s, Spaniards report of seeing Indians drop dead in front of them from starvation as the weather affected them, as slavery affected them, and as hunger did. So 90%. And one of the things to think about, particularly for those in the audience who are Jews, I think many of us are aware of what the loss of 90% of our population did in countries like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, how much it destroyed the intellectual life, the social life, the everything. And just think about then what that meant for Indians who lost 90% of their population. So that's something we share, a date and a percentage. We also both are characterized by concepts which were at the core of our community. For Jews, concepts like shalom, mitzvah, tzedek, tzedakah. In the Navajo community, which I have somewhat more experience in, a term that people refer to a lot is the concept of ostensibly means kinship, but it refers to a great deal more than that. First of all, it includes relationships with the non-human world, but it also includes things like effective action, solidarity, love, compassion, kindness, friendliness, generosity, and peacefulness. So we have these terms at the core of who we are. And we share common struggles too, for religious freedom and for cultural survival, for revival of languages, and for our sacred lands, our holy lands. For instance, Navajos say that Navajo land, the Nebakea, is the land that was given to them by the holy people and is marked by 4 mountains, the sacred mountains of the directions. And one of those mountains you can see from here. It's Mount Taylor in English. For Acoma, it means snow-capped peaks. And for Navajos, it's the sacred mountain of the south. In Navajo, it's called Tzotzich, turquoise bead mountain. So there's this concept that the holy people, changing woman, talking God, and others, gave this land to the Navajo people. And as we Jews know, at least, we believe that in some fashion, God gave us the land of Israel, not any particular political boundary, and I'm not going to go there, not this boundary, but not that, but the land of Israel, to which the children of Israel went in 40 years of wandering in the desert when they got out of Egypt. So we have that in common. And a way to begin to understand and to reach out is to listen. And what I want to do now is present 2 voices. Here is the first voice, and it's a Jewish voice. By the rivers of Babylon, we sit down and weep when we remember Zion. On the poplars in her midst, we hang our harps, for there our captors ask us to compose songs. Those who mock us demand that we be happy, saying, "Sing for us a song about Zion." How can we sing a song to the Lord in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand be crippled. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you and do not give Jerusalem priority over whatever gives me the most joy. And that's the 137th Psalm. And here's another voice, and this is a Navajo voice, and for this audience requires a little bit of historical background. From 1864 to 1868, the majority of Navajo people were exiled from Denebakea under the activities of Kit Carson and the U.S. Army, exiled on the Long Walk and to Fort Sumner, which was a bleak, bitter, desolate place. People died en route, and probably as many as 1/3 to 1/4 of the Navajo population died at Fort Sumner. of starvation, of thirst, of disease. It was not good. In the spring of 1868, General William Sherman came to Fort Sumner. He sat down to negotiate a change with the Navajo chief Bronitsky and other tribal leaders. And what he said is recorded by one of, well, essentially by Sherman's secretary after being translated from Navajo into English. So we do have a native voice speaking, although admittedly in translation. And Bronitsky said, "I hope you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own," end quote. And then outside the council, his Sherman's secretary noted that women clutched Sherman's coat and with tears in their eyes begged him to send them home. And he was really quite moved. And here's a little more of what Bronitsky said, again, quoting from Sherman's secretary in English. "When the Diné were first created, 4 mountains and 4 rivers were pointed out to us, inside of which we should live. That was to be our country and was given to us by the first woman of the Diné tribe. It was told to us by our forefathers that we were never to move east of the Rio Grande or west of the San Juan rivers. And I think that our coming here has been the cause of so much death among us and our animals. When one of our big men dies, the cries of the women cause the tears to roll down to my mustache. I think then of my own country. If we're taken back to our own country, we will call you our father and mother. If you should only tie a goat there, we would all live off it, all of the same opinion. I am speaking for the whole tribe, for their animals, from the horse to the dog, also the unborn. It appears to me that the general commands this whole thing as a god. I hope, therefore, he will do all he can for my people. And I wish you to tell us when you are going to take us back to our country," end quote. Now, in New Mexico in particular, and in the United States in general, Jewish organizations have traditionally not really reached out to American Indians, although Jewish organizations in Canada really have, and I'll be talking about that in a little minute. But even so, Jews in New Mexico have a long history of outreach, interaction, and dialogue between Jews and Indians. Solomon Bibo, a merchant from Germany who became governor at Acoma Pueblo in 1885, the only non-Indian ever to serve as official leader of an Indian tribe. Toby Grossman, a member of Congregation Albert, who helped found the American Indian Law Program at UNM. Tony Isaacs, who was really the first person to record American Indian music as it was being performed rather than in a studio. Felix Cohen, who wrote the Handbook of American Indian Law and served as Miguel Trujillo's attorney when Miguel sued the state of New Mexico. And Avram Organic, and many more. And throughout the years, again and again, the same questions have come up from Indians that I know. How have Jews survived? Do Jews regard the land of Israel the way that native people regard their sacred lands? How was Hebrew revived? Could it be relevant to helping native languages flourish again? For those of you who aren't familiar, for a very long time, really until the 1880s, 1890s, Hebrew had become a sacred language. You read Torah in it, you prayed in it, but that was about it. And then under the inspired vision of a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda, Eliezer and others began to turn Hebrew into a modern language, so that now, for better or worse, in Hebrew, you can buy and sell drugs, you can discuss nuclear weapons, you can order from a restaurant. And that means when I listen to native people talk about their land and their language and how they want it to be a modern language. And for instance, Rex Lee Jim, the man I mentioned earlier, is a poet and has published his poetry in Navajo. I got him published in Navajo in Ireland, which is quite something. But anyway, and he wants to, and others want to make sure that Navajo becomes a 21st century language. So for Jews, when I talk to Jews about Rex Lee Jim, all I have to do is say, Rexley Jim is the Navajo Ben Yehuda, and everybody knows what that means. And I think that's really a good thing. And New Mexico is unique in other ways. And for instance, having Pueblo feast days open to the public, Native American arts and crafts, which often become a way to begin listening to Native voices. As merchants began encouraging the transition of pottery and weaving in particular from essentially practical things to art forms, which meant that among other things, Indians could make much more money. There began to be tours, the Harvey House tours of Indian pueblos, and people would come and stay at the La Fonda and Santa Fe and take a tour and see Indians selling stuff and buying it. And we tend to look down on that, I think, now. But what it meant was by 1900, many, many people in the East had, an Indian souvenir, had been on these tours, had met Indians, and they turned out to be allies in a major crisis that no one had expected. Basically, in the 1880s, the Supreme Court ruled that Pueblo Indians were not Indians in a federal sense because they did not exist in a treaty relationship with the United States government. They existed in a land grant relationship. And what this meant was that Indian land, Pueblo land, particularly north of Santa Fe, was up for grabs, and there was a big land rush. And it was regarded, as you might understand, with just horror. In 1912, the tribal council at Tesuque, which is just north of Santa Fe, barricaded themselves in their tribal office, and they said they would die before they gave up their land. And what it meant then, as this proceeded, there were a lot of people in the East who served as allies and who helped the National Women's Club, which was one of the major organizations fighting the Supreme Court decision. And ultimately, in the 1930s, this decision was overturned, and it took several years after that to clear up the land mess. Oh, fat. So this is some of the things that have happened. And personally, I've facilitated Jewish and American Indian dialogues for a long time, and I want to talk about them because what I really want to do is encourage people to think about what they can do, or as sometimes I say jokingly, I plant seeds, I add manure, and I wait. And I say I have a PhD, which stands for piled higher and deeper. So I'm good at it. So for instance, I organized a fundraiser for a Jewish women's group called Hadassah and the Albuquerque Indian Center called Sacred Land, Holy Land. Jewish and American Indian poets read from their work in English, Hebrew, and Navajo. And oddly enough, the problem with, I knew people who were writing in Navajo, but it took a long time to find anyone who was writing poetry in Hebrew in Albuquerque. I mean, God, for 2 years, every time I'd go to a party where there were Jews, I'd say, anyone who's writing in Hebrew? Finally, I found somebody, thank goodness. For a long time, I organized a Jemez Pueblo Arts and Crafts Fair at Congregation Albert, which was very popular. Even now, when I go to Jemez, people will come up to me and say how much they enjoyed that. I was, somewhat to my surprise, invited to give a Jewish prayer at the Navajo Nation President Prayer Breakfast in Shiprock in 2019, when Jonathan Nez became president, which was another interesting experience. I've brought 2 Navajo chairmen, or presidents rather, Navajo presidents to speak at Congregation Albert and a governor at Acoma. And now started asking Native leaders here if they would be willing to speak to Jewish audiences in sort of a regular series, so we shall see. But perhaps the one that I'm proudest of was a Navajo Jewish dialogue that I organized at Congregation Albert with Navajo medicine man Johnson Dennison, whom I had known before from other things, and Rabbi Harry Rosenfeld, who is now Rabbi Emeritus there, one of the best rabbis I ever met. But in any case, over the course of about a year or two, there were 3 dialogues, 2 of them in Albuquerque, 1 of them in Window Rock. The first one was living in 2 worlds. How do we keep our balance? The second one was what makes land sacred? And the third, which was Johnson Dennison's idea, was healing the wounds of history, the long walk and the Holocaust. And the core of this dialogue was that both speakers spoke from their own knowledge of their own traditions and their own communities, grappling with questions of interest to both communities. And it was interesting because I told Johnson and I told Rabbi Rosenfeld, I said, frankly, when we have the dialogue in Albuquerque, Johnson Dennison is going to be pretty exotic and people are going to ask him most of their questions. But when we go to Window Rock, Rabbi Rosenfeld is going to be exotic and people are going to ask him most of their questions, which is what they did. So there are many opportunities to experience what I think of as native controlled spaces and Jewish controlled spaces. Pueblo dances are native controlled spaces. They control the terms, they control who comes in. There are dances which are closed to the public. And believe me, you do not get into those ever. You usually don't hear about them, in fact. And so, we have Jewish spaces and Indian spaces where we have our own history and our own scripts. Both of us dealing with outsiders who would put us in their scripts, telling us who we are, telling us who we're not. But these scripts are not ours. And we state what our own scripts are. And what I'd like to do, as long as we're talking about it, is to recommend a book. I used to be a professor. What can I say? There's a book by a man named Gerald Levy, which is called In the Beginning, which is available on Amazon. Everything is. But he was a Jew. He was an anthropologist. He wrote a really excellent book on American Indian drinking. But his last book was In the Beginning. And he wanted to look at, he was a student of the Navajo and spoke it too. He wanted to look at how the Navajo creation story was as subtle and nuanced and powerful as our own creation story, which we call the Book of Genesis. How did it deal with questions like, why does evil happen? Why do we all speak different languages? What does it mean to be good? Because those are questions the Book of Genesis deals with, in between, of course, dealing with dysfunctional families, which is what it does. And now I'd like to turn our attention in terms of what can be done to our neighbors to the north. And I don't mean Colorado, I mean Canada. This year, the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada, which represents all the Reformed Jewish communities in the country, has launched a program called Roadmap to Reconciliation in advance of National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is observed on June 21st in Canada. So this is happening as we speak. And this program, Roadmap to Reconciliation, was really inspired by the success of recent Jewish and Indigenous programs hosted by congregations in Ottawa and Toronto. So that, for instance, my personal favorite, just look here for a minute, is a program at Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. They'll join with an elder of the Nipissing First Nation. They're going to host a musical event that will showcase Indigenous music and Jewish music. And the cantor at Holy Blossom will play a key role in helping marry aspects of both musical worlds for this service, which will probably happen around Sukkot. Think about this. Sukkot, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a Jewish holiday in the fall, celebrates the harvest. We live in, or we try to live in, brush-covered huts, basically. And that's something that a lot of Native people can relate to. Another synagogue, Sha'arei Bet El in Oakville, Ontario, is going to organize a day of sharing circles for Jewish and Indigenous community members, giving participants an opportunity to talk about their cultures and traditions. The synagogue is going to display art from local Indigenous creators and feature information about a new memorial garden created by survivors of a nearby residential school for Indigenous children. And this is planned for October 15th. In residential schools, boarding schools were often a real disaster. And it began the discovery really began in British Columbia when Native people who had known this for a long time began pushing for the formal burial and recognition of children who had died at residential schools, who had been taken away to boarding schools at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 and had never gone home. We have that here too. There's a park in Albuquerque, which has a number of anonymous graves of children, which are almost certainly from the Albuquerque Indian School in the 1880s. And so people are beginning to do that. Even in the summer camp movement, summer camps are big for Jews. And the Reform Movement's Camp George in Ontario is going to continue hosting Anishinaabe, or Chippewa, or Ojibwe educators, and they're going to provide campers and staff and faculty with activities about Indigenous communities, and members of nearby congregations and other summer camps are going to be invited to participate in this event. So what I really would like to do, what I hope I've done, is to get you thinking, to plant seeds again, add my manure, I can do that. And to begin thinking, what could we do? For instance, just really recently, about, I guess 3 months ago now, I created a program for a Jewish community center in Arizona, which was Zoom, so it was like, national. And let me explain what I did. One of my friends is a man named David Cornsill, who is the genealogist for the Cherokee Nation. I've known him since he brought me to Sallisaw for that stomp dance, which is about 1989. And he's always been my go-to person. Whenever I read in the news, that somebody says they're Cherokee, I write to him, I email him. I say, are they really Cherokee? And usually he says, no, they're pretendians. I thought that was an interesting phrase. And over the years, we've talked about, Native people are afflicted by pretendians. Jews have people we call Messianic Jews, Jews for Jesus, whatever. And so I put together a 2-person panel discussion with a rabbi from Houston and an Indian activist from Portland under the auspices of this Jewish community center in Chandler, Arizona. It was called Claiming Identities Which Aren't Theirs, Pretendians and quote unquote Messianic Jews. And it was really fascinating. First of all, neither speaker knew that the other community had people who claimed Indian identities or Jewish identities they really had no right to. So that's something we can do. And there are many other things that I really would hope that, in my case, the Jewish community would consider. But we have to see. So there's a wonderful Navajo phrase, which means, let's do it. And perhaps that's a good way to gradually end. The phrase is, Adil ni, let's do it. And I really want to close with a saying from the Talmud, from Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. And it says, this is from Pirkei Avot, Ben Zoma says, who is the wise one? He who learns from all men, as it says in the book of Psalms, I have acquired understanding from all my teachers, unquote. And I have had the great, amazing good luck and great fortune to learn from many teachers over the years in many different places. And I want to close this particular talk by thanking some of the best teachers I've ever had, the Chinle Valley Singers and the founder, Elizabeth Davis, whose memory continues to be a blessing to all who knew her. And a special thanks to other teachers from that group, Linda Davis and Elsie Deswood. Ahehe and Toda Rabbah. So that concludes what I said, and now it's your turn. If you have questions, please put them in the chat if you haven't done that already. And I will let our gracious host choose the questions and read them, and I will try to answer them as honestly as I can. Sounds like a plan. Now it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bronitsky. Very informative. Do we have any questions? We'll give a couple minutes for people to think of it.
Break out of your shells.
If I could, what got you fascinated into the world of Indians and the lives of Indian Americans and brought you to do all the things that you're doing?
Well, first of all, it helped that I grew up in Albuquerque as opposed to, let's say, Amarillo. A lot of it, I think I can ascribe to my mother. My mother was, anyway, she she went back to school in her, how old was she? She was in 53. In her late 40s, early 50s, she went back to UNM to get a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, when it wasn't common for older women to go back to school, and it wasn't that common for women to do this, especially considering even then the goal was for a woman to get her bachelor, or man. My mother already had one. That was my father. Anyway, she took a lot of anthropology courses and archaeology courses, and I just became fascinated. And my mother and I, and to a lesser extent my father, began going to Pueblo feast days and meeting people, and I just loved it. And so eventually I became an archaeologist, but I continued, enjoying the company of living people as well. And I became a professor and became a gypsy academic. And in 1984, an event occurred which changed my life. I became a senior Fulbright professor at the University of Frankfurt in what was then West Germany. Brought my wife and my 2 kids and taught Germans about American Indians, and lectured all over Europe on mostly American Indian topics. Because then, much later, we then moved to Albuquerque, 85 to 90. I was an adjunct professor. And I realized that being an adjunct, whether at UNM where I was or anywhere else, was so demeaning and so degrading that either I could live my life on my knees or I could stand up. And living on my knees did not strike me as a meaningful career choice. So I decided I would get out of academia as soon as I could. And so the last year I actually was an academic was 1992. And basically I said to myself, Gordon, okay, we know what you don't like. You're real clear on that. What is it you like, and what the hell are you going to do? And by that time I had seen, the European interest in Indians, although it tended to be very traditional and focused. And in 1994, 10 years after I first went to Germany, something else happened that, and again, in retrospect, changed my life. And I was trying to find dance groups, figure out how to tour, but didn't know what I was doing. And I met, God, how can you describe her? I met a Navajo woman who was proud of who she was, who was dynamic, who was energetic. And we met, and she said, Gordon, we're Navajo and we're proud of our culture. Can you help us take it further? And that woman was Linda Davis. How could I not? I was really amazingly ignorant about how to do it. I just stumbled into it. For instance, the first place that I toured the Chinle Valley Singers to was Estonia. And I came back and I was talking with a friend of mine who was an artist. I said, I just did this tour to Estonia, but I told her, did is probably not the verb. What is the verb for what I did? She said, you produced it. And I was quite surprised, because to me, produce has visions of, Hollywood spectaculars, Broadway. And she said, no, produce means somebody who has talent. You figure out who wants it and how to get the money to make it happen. You did all that, you produced it. So I learned on the fly. And since then, I've done a lot more, but that's where it all started. I mean, just as an example, right now, my big Indian project, please God, I'm trying to create an annual International Indigenous Culinary Festival, hopefully here in Albuquerque, which will showcase Indigenous chefs and Indigenous food producers from around the world. And I'm bringing a chef from Zimbabwe here in September. I also brought her last August. So anyway, other questions? Dead silence.
We have one from Ronnie Sims, who says, very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Could you speak a bit about Jews and Indians sharing each other's concerns, such as the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Absolutely. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is a crisis in Indian country. A lot of it, is a reflection of sexism, of poverty, of racism, in which Indian women and Indian men, for that matter, are missing. Somebody hitchhikes somewhere and they're never seen again. And For a long time, police didn't seem really interested. And for a long time, it was also very difficult because certainly on reservations like the Navajo Nation, there's so few police. I mean, they try, don't get me wrong, their police are fairly good. But, you know, God forbid I murder somebody in Chiltern Beat, though. Police will take 3 hours to get there. I'm going to be long gone. And so it began really in Canada, as many things do, and has spread to the United States. Deb Haaland, who is the Secretary of Interior, has created a special office at Interior to deal with missing and murdered Indigenous women. In fact, when she was still our representative from District 1, she had Shabbat dinner at my house, which was really a wonderful experience. So there's a lot of that dealing with the fact and saying that this is wrong, that it's got to stop. Sometimes it's clear what's happening. For instance, in the Northern Plains, where there's where the oil boom is going on, a lot of them near reservations, there's something called, because the workers on the oil fields are all men, they're often called man camps. And a lot of those man camps probably have something to do with the disappearance and murder of Indian women. And here in the Southwest, well, I find it amazing personally, because I'm an old guy, that a lot of this is posted by my friends on Facebook. You know, there'll be a picture of a woman and they'll say, this is who she is, this is where she was last seen, this is what tattoo she has or whatever. And her parents are desperate to find her. If anybody knows where this woman is, call this number. And other things like that. I had somebody speak virtually, to Congregation Albert, I think it was now 2 years ago, on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And theoretically, underline theoretically, the Congregation Albert Sisterhood in October, I've arranged for them to have a speaker on missing and murdered Indigenous women. Personally, I thought the issue is such a crisis that I didn't tell them, but I want to say, how can you wait till October? They're dying now. But, you know, you settle for what you can. You do what you can. So other questions. Does that answer your question, Ronnie? Thank you. Other questions?
Susan asks, do all the Indian tribes you mentioned have a written system for their own language?
Sort of. The only one that really developed indigenously was written Cherokee, which was developed by a great man named Sequoyah in the 1840s, who created a syllabary. It's not a ripoff of, you know, English in that way. And one of the things I always liked about it, it spread so quickly that particularly Cherokee men would start going on trips so they could write letters in Cherokee to their girlfriends. I thought that was nice. For other languages, often missionaries or linguists have played a role. For instance, for Navajos, one of the key people in written Navajo was a Franciscan priest in the 1880s who really took the time to learn Navajo, who was widely regarded as a friend by Navajos. And then the language changed, and it's been taught at UNM as a language for 50 years. And there's now an annual short film festival in Navajo at Window Rock. There are Navajos who are publishing poetry in Navajo, which I love. Sometimes it's linguists. There's a linguist named Melissa Axelrod at UNM who is working to create a dictionary of Nambe Tewa from Nambe Pueblo and doing that. Sometimes as languages fade, sometimes these linguistic records are all that's left. And sometimes languages are revived in ways that are just amazing. And the favorite example that I give is a language called Wampanoag. Wampanoag is, now I can say is, an Indian language spoken in Massachusetts. But it stopped being a spoken language around 1850, 1860. And about 20 years ago now, a Wampanoag tribal member, a woman named Jessie Little Doe Baird, said she heard the language call to her and she determined to revive it. And she did. It was amazing. First of all, it helped that there were a lot of written documents in Wampanoag from the colonial period, a lot of which were land claim arguments, in which Wampanoags would put their land claim in Wampanoag to British colonial courts. So that was part of it. And it helped that there are still languages spoken in Maine, which are related to Wampanoag. Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, all related. And she began reviving it. In the course of that, she got a PhD in linguistics from MIT too. And now her children speak Wampanoag. And there are Wampanoag language classes in all the Wampanoag communities, in Mashpee, in Gay Head, really amazing. And these others are doing the Miami language, which used to be spoken, oddly enough, in Ohio, is now in Oklahoma. Miami is being revived. There are some languages, unfortunately, that will never be revived because they're linguistic isolates, like Tonkawa, which was spoken in Texas. Then they were exiled to Oklahoma. Not going to happen for Tonkawa. So there are written languages, and people are being very creative. In Nunavut, as I always think of it, way the heck North Canada, there's a filmmaker named Zacharias Kunuk who created the first full-length feature film in Inuktitut, in Inuit language. It's called The Fast Runner. It's available on Netflix. Highly recommended. And he said, it's a film with actors and a plot. It is not a documentary. And he's done a number of other things. And other people are beginning to do it. Haida in British Columbia created a film called The Edge of the Knife in Haida, which was a lot because only about 10 people speak Haida, but they wanted to do it. Maori gave a presentation of Hamlet in Maori to the Queen of England, and there are a lot of other things. And one of my fantasies, at this stage, it's a fantasy, is to produce a festival celebrating creativity in indigenous languages. In hip hop, for instance, particularly, well, in the United States, but in Latin America, God, indigenous hip hop in native languages is wild. I brought a Mapuche Indian hip hop singer from Chile here, a guy named Luanco, who is very good. I think he's in Mexico at the moment. He has a hip hop tune called, in English, I Return to My Language, and that's on YouTube. And I'll spoil the ending, but essentially it's in Mapuche language. Among other things, part of the film, they burned the Chilean flag. But what I loved and what was so powerful, at the end, there are 3 young Mapuche people whose mouths are covered with duct tape. And just one by one, they tear it off. You don't have to speak Mapuche to figure out what that means. And there are a lot of other things like that. So I hope that answers your question. A long answer, but I thought we should know about these things. Other questions?
Thank you so much. That's all we have for now for questions. Could I ask you to speak on your nonprofit a little bit, Indigenous?
Okay. Indigenous is the nonprofit production arm of my for-profit business, which is called, oddly enough, Bronitsky and Associates. And it is deeply involved with the creation of this International Indigenous Culinary Festival. Like I said, we brought a chef from Zimbabwe last year. We're going to bring her in September, and I'm doing everything I can to bring a couple of others leading to an annual festival. I want to bring a single chef a Maya chef from Guatemala, a Maya chef from Mexico, and a stunning Cree chef from Alberta. Oh, I'm working on this. I'm always, frankly, looking for money. That's what I really do, is I try to find money. As I tell people, I try to find money without using a gun. Using a gun is not a good fundraising technique. I do not recommend it. Like, support my project or I'll kill you. Not good. I don't. So that's what it is. It's the nonprofit production arm that I work with, that I created. And I like the name. It's a mashup of indigenous and now. And now in this title is capitalized. So when I talk to people, I often say, well, if you want to if you want to pronounce indigenous correctly, it's indigenous. So does that answer your question, I hope?
Absolutely. And right on topic, someone asked, where did your idea for the culinary event come from?
Oh God, where did it come from? Oh, I know. To show you how long these things take. I moved back to Albuquerque in 2003. And about 2005, I got involved in something called Creative Santa Fe, and I was schlepping up there once or twice a month for years. Oh, feck. And they wanted ideas, and I created a lot. And in some senses, what I wanted, they're all really similar. For instance, I also proposed an International Indigenous Performing Arts Festival, an International Indigenous Gospel Festival. You get the picture, hopefully. And it occurred to me that you could also have an International Indigenous Culinary Festival with Indigenous chefs and Indigenous food producers. It went nowhere. It wasn't until several years later that Loretta Oden, who's actually from Oklahoma, is a Citizens Band Potawatomi, created the Corn Dance Cafe in Santa Fe, which really was the first restaurant owned by an Indian with an Indian chef. And she's moved back to, now she lives in Tecumseh, Oklahoma. And you're seeing that a lot more in Minneapolis. Sean Sherman, who's Lakota, created a restaurant called Owamni, which makes a point. They don't serve any food that wasn't here before, after, before 1490. It has to be food that was before 1492. He won the James Beard Award 2 years ago. He's on Time Magazine's list of 100 most influential people. He's a mover and a shaker. But there's this whole explosion of people who are trying to, depending on who you talk to, decolonize the diet or restore food sovereignty. These are all chefs who generally dislike fry bread. As they point out, it's a food for Navajos that they learned how to make at Fort Sumner. The government gives you rations of lard and flour. Okay, what are you going to do with that fry bread? But there's Indian-owned restaurants in Chile, in Brazil, in Greenland. Yeah, trust me, I know these things. And I just thought what I would like to do is create a mechanism for people to profit from it, to sell it. Because a lot of them, not all of them, are local or small scale. They can't compete with, major food producers. They just can't. But people are looking for authenticity, and authentic, original Indian food is something that people I think will want. My definition of what indigenous food is simply food produced by indigenous food producers. So that, for instance, certainly buffalo counts, and corn and seafood and shellfish in the Northwest, but it also includes beef. It includes wine. It includes beer. Albuquerque has 2 American Indian-owned brew pubs. Actually, one's in Albuquerque, I think. The other's in Rio Rancho. But should you ever need to know this, Bow and Arrow and Turtle Mountain are both Indian-owned. And I keep thinking, imagine having an indigenous beer tasting or an indigenous wine tasting. And these are award-winning wines in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand. Not so much here. Santa Ana grows wine grapes, but they sell them to Gruet. And it's really funny. I went to Osuyus, which is in British Columbia, just north of the US border, where they really have an award-winning wine industry there. Seriously, big time. And it's really funny because I heard the chairman, Clarence Louis, speak. And he said he was quite proud, justifiably, of this vineyard and this winery. He said, people have asked him, are you encouraging Indian drinking by creating wines? And he said he didn't know any alcoholics who really preferred a $25 bottle of wine. I could just see it. Yeah, I'm going to get plowed this weekend. I'd like a Riesling, please. And that's not how that works. But anyway, so there is that. And there's all kinds of, I think California has at least 3 brew pubs. Oklahoma has 1. North Carolina has 1. And I think what all these people want to do is to control what they sell and to sell it on their terms. And sometimes it's really, there's a Northern California has a native owned, a tribally owned brewery called Mad River Brewery. They arranged a deal with the San Francisco Giants to sell it at games. Ooh, okay, that'll work. So anyway, that's part of it. So that's a long story again, but that's how I really got into it and came into it. Just the idea that, I mean, really, native people do such cool things. More people should know about it, buy it, eat it, drink it, whatever. That's sort of what that is. Other questions?
Thank you so much. We have one more among lots of compliments and gratefulness for your talk. Jennifer asks, can you discuss some similarities between Native American and Jewish practices? And are these similarities coincidental or because of interactions between the two?
Well, first of all, it helps to remember that there are over 550 federally recognized tribes. All of them are quite different. We think of buffalo and teepees. That's the Great Plains. Indians in Washington State or in British Columbia or Northern California had no idea what buffalo were or what a teepee was or anything else. And so that it means that there's an equal diversity of religious practice, and within that, there's a great deal of diversity. For instance, among Navajos, there are Navajos who are very, very serious evangelical fundamentalists who really don't like the traditional thing. They think it's pagan. And I've met people who did that. I have met some Navajos who are really traditional and don't really identify as Christian. And certainly among Pueblos, there's a real interesting movement to sort of get away from that. With that said, I don't think there are that many similarities. I think that the way that I pray as a Jew is not the way that Navajos pray with tadidin, with corn pollen, or with Pueblos with cornmeal. I went to Sandia Pueblo's feast day on Tuesday, and it was wonderful. But you see all these people have little cornmeal bags. And what that means for me personally, I have always made it clear when I work with people that I am what I am, that I'm a Jew. And we do have things in common, but more in how we look at the world. For instance, something that I tell Indians a lot that really resonates and that often gets into good discussions, I'll tell them, I'm not the kind of Jew my grandfather was, and I'm not the kind of Jew my grandchildren will be, but I would like us all to be Jews. And they relate. I say, you're not the kind of Navajo your grandfather was. Not going to be the kind of Navajo your grandchildren are going to be. I bet you want them to be Navajo. And they do. And you see it in all sorts of fascinating ways. If I could just use one example, bar mitzvah, for instance, the Jewish coming of age ritual for boys and girls at 13. A lot of 99% of Jewish kids in the United States do not speak Hebrew, strangely enough. And it means that, for a year before your bar bat mitzvah, you take lessons from the rabbi and you drill and you read from the Torah in Hebrew, and then most of the time you forget it. Well, like for instance, when I went to this Kena Alda, this woman's coming of age ceremony, the girl for whom it was had didn't speak Navajo at all. But it was because I talked to her grandmother, who's my friend Linda, and they said they wanted her to know that she is a Navajo woman. And that's a feeling that I get from Jews. Bar mitzvah, maybe we'll stop going to temple after it happens, but I want him or her to know that they are Jews. So obviously, when you see people who are really Christian, you'll see certain things. For instance, just as an example, when I went to the Navajo Nation President's Prayer Breakfast, several of the people there were blowing shofars, but that's not because they think what they're getting it from is evangelical Protestantism, where that has become a thing to sort of live the life that they think Jesus lived when they have those imitation seders, which never happened in Jesus' time anyway, never. So that, for instance, I know that when Jonathan Nez, the last Navajo president, was sworn in for the second term, the person who swore him in was wearing a talit, the Jewish prayer shawl, but not because he was Jewish or secretly Jewish. I think it was Ernest So, who is the pastor at Navajo Victory Church in Shiprock, because Jonathan Nez and his then vice president, Myron Leiser, were very, 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 very serious Protestant fundamentalists. Oh boy. I mean, I'd studied Baptist for 4 years, so I knew the language of the religion that they were talking about. But in other words, no, I really don't. And I would be hesitant to say that. Certainly for Pueblo Indians, they're not going to tell you what their religion is ever anyway, under any circumstances. Get over it. And I'm often hesitant too, because a lot of times the people that I know, I'm not, and it's not a survey based on anything. Native people think that white people want to steal their religion. As one of them said, they stole our land, now they want our religion. What do they mean by that? That means when you see white people smudging with sage or beating on a drum or taking psychedelics without any understanding of what it is or what they're doing, but it makes them feel good. Well, I'm sorry, that just does not work. You know, when Native people see, for in terms of the peyote religion, see white people taking it for fun, it's not like that. I went to a peyote service near Smith Lake last year, and I've just been invited to one near Casamaro, but I don't think I'm going to be able to go. It's really, really strenuous. It starts at sunset and it goes till dawn. And it's very intense emotionally. I didn't take peyote because I was driving home. Didn't want to do that, which is fine. But so I would just say there are a lot of excellent books about Native religion, which I would encourage you to read. Jerry Levy's book is one. There are others. And there's still a lot of god-awful dreck. Ugh, fat. For instance, for Pueblo people, there's a wonderful book called The Tewa World by Alfonso Ortiz. And to show you how life changes, Alfonso Ortiz was an anthropologist. He was from San Juan Pueblo. He was really an amazing man. His son is the one who owns Turtle Mountain Brewery. I love that. So no, and sun dancing is real different than Washington State Coast spirit dancing. And a lot of times it's controversial. I know that, for instance, the Navajo Nation, several years ago, people organized a sun dance there and people were appalled. I mean, young people did it. Everyone else was just appalled at it. It's like the response that the peyote religion got when peyotism came to the Navajo Nation in the 30s. A lot of people hated it. Traditionals hated it because it wasn't traditional. Christian Navajos hated it because it wasn't Christian. And now Navajo peyotes were arrested in the 30s and their goods were confiscated until Raymond Nakai ran for chairman in 54 on a religious freedom platform. And everyone knew what it meant, and that changed things. It can be even more controversial. At Taos in the 20s, peyote boys were publicly whipped. And they meant it. They were not kidding around. So I don't know if that's the answer you were hoping for, expecting, or want. I would encourage you, first of all, to read anything Bill Powers wrote on Lakota religion is going to be good. Pamela Amos's book, Coast Salish Spirit Dancing, is wonderful. There are a lot of very good books about Navajo religion, not many about Pueblo religion, but that's because they don't want to talk about it. They won't. And it can lead to negative consequences when they do. So, I don't know. If you want, you ask me again, and I'll see if I can perhaps provide a more satisfactory answer.
Thank you so much. Any other questions for our speaker? All right, in that case, we might let him go tonight. Thank you so much for shining a light on the, go ahead.
And let me know about the recording, because several people did ask me about it. And I know that Stephen has my email address and all that. And thank you for recording it. And thank you all for being such an excellent audience. Yay! I appreciate it.
Thank you again,
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you, Marcia. Yes, so important that that we're shining this light on these parallels and promoting the expression as you're doing with your nonprofit of these cultures. I do want to mention we talked about the bar and bat mitzvah. That's actually the topic of our July dialogue. So if you're interested, be sure to sign up for the mailing list at nminterfaithdialogue.org. And that'll be Cantor Finn of Congregation Albert. Yeah, it should be very exciting.
She's going to be great. Oh, sign up for that. She's good. There.
We're all excited, yes. Although you set the bar very high today, so.
I'll do my best.
All right, we have our webmaster, Steve Wiedobre with our closing prayer. Thank you, Steve.
Learn to see God in all persons, of whatever race or creed. You will know what divine love is when you begin to feel your oneness with every human being, not before. And that's from Paramahansa Yogananda. Amen.